Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. On the program so far, we have been hearing about how the booming population here in New Brunswick is putting pressure on the school system. That fast growth is hitting other public services as well, while also handing the province's progressive conservative government a revenue windfall. It sparked a new kind of political debate here that will come to a head in a provincial election that is scheduled for the 21st of October, a vote in which these New Brunswickers could play a deciding role. Joining us now to talk about that is the CBC's provincial affairs reporter in New Brunswick. No one better to talk about politics here than Jacques, who's with me in studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you here. We were just talking about this education piece, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but you could hear the tension, I think, between a couple of different parties there and what this means. A population that's increasing, students feeling as though they're being squeezed in the schools, parents worried about this and worried about whether there's a future for their students in public education or they put them in private. How live, just broadly, how live of an issue do you think this is?
Well, when the government announced its capital budget last year, the first question we asked was, how many schools are you building? Because this has been a huge issue, especially in Moncton, as you heard, where the schools are just bursting at the seams and they literally can't keep up. And the minister said, we cannot build schools fast enough. There just isn't the money and the way to do it quickly.
That's just one part of the equation here. Where else are we seeing the impacts of the population boom?
Well, housing costs, rents, home prices are hitting unprecedented levels. Property tax bills have shot up at unprecedented rates as a result. We've had many horror stories over the last few years about rent spikes. That led to a big political debate about rent caps. In healthcare, tens of thousands of new patients in the system. Some numbers here that I have from the New Brunswick Health Council. In 2017, only 7% of New Brunswickers did not have a primary care provider. Last year, that was up to 21%.
Wow.
So access to healthcare is always an issue, but now it's really acute. Among immigrants, 21% did not have access in 2017, and last year it was 53%, so more than half. And where do people end up if they don't have access to primary care? In the emergency department. And wait times there have just been wild in the last few years. More horror stories from emergency departments. This is the Premier, Blaine Higgs, in his State of the Province speech in January, acknowledging how hard it's been to keep up.
And I think you've all seen the growth in our province has been unprecedented. I want to thank New Brunswickers everywhere and acknowledge that we find ourselves in very challenging times. And while it can be exciting to see so much development and interest in our province, it's also been difficult managing that growth with the impact it is having on housing, healthcare, and schools. We're investing more than ever, but the reality is that our growth has come very quickly.
So he used the word unprecedented. I mentioned that as well earlier this morning. How fast is the population growing here in New Brunswick?
Well, for those of us of a certain age, we've always thought of New Brunswick's population as 750,000 people because we were literally stuck at that number for a long time. The province hit that number in 1994, and then it stayed there for about 15 years. It didn't budge. It fluctuated, it shrank a bit, it grew a bit, but it was in that ballpark. Then in 2009, it started to grow again modestly and then faster and faster, and it reached 800,000 in 2022 and 850,000 this year. So if you think about that, it took 28 years to add 50,000 people and just another 2 years to add another 50,000. So that's how fast things have picked up. And it's still going. StatsCan has a real-time projection model that shows another 14,000 just since its last official count. So it's just racing and racing. Last week, the province paused one of its provincial immigration programs because all 3,000 spots for this year had already been taken. It's going to restart next year, but that level of demand is just, again, something we haven't seen before and a measure of how things have changed here.
So help me understand that. What's driving that growth?
Well, the start of it all seems to be federal immigration policy, according to economist Richard Saillant. He's based here. He follows these trends very closely, and he ties it to the Trudeau government increasing immigration levels to Canada, which in turn tightened the housing supply nationwide.
Essentially, what we're seeing in terms of population dynamics is a lot of people, both newcomers and existing residents, opting to go to places where housing is less expensive, still less expensive than in the nation's hotspots, particularly Toronto, and moving to New Brunswick, but also the rest of the Maritimes and including many places in the prairies. So it's people fanning out of Toronto because housing is unaffordable, and migrants choosing to come directly to New Brunswick as opposed to the traditional immigration hotspots, largely probably as a result of the national housing affordability crisis.
So you have two streams. I mean, immigrants and the people from other provinces having a big impact. You can imagine why people want to come here. It's a glorious place. Beautiful. Is there an upside to that?
Well, for sure. I mean, for years, politicians wanted the population to grow. And, you know, when it was stagnant for that long stretch I was talking about, it really felt like a failure. The growth has brought new people, new energy, new diversity, a bit of swagger to public officials, and it has brought a lot of money. All these people are paying more income tax, so a flood of additional income tax revenue, sales tax revenue, federal transfer payments, which are based on population in many cases, have soared far beyond the budget projections of the provincial government in the last 4 straight years. So this has led to huge surpluses every year, which have reduced the provincial debt, but that in turn has prompted a debate on whether more of that money should be spent expanding the services like building schools that are under strain. Exactly.
Parents calling for schools to be built.
Yeah, exactly. And now government spending has started to catch up to the revenue. In fact, just in the last few days, the government projected a small deficit this year because of healthcare costs continuing to soar. That deficit may or may not be eliminated by the time the fiscal year is over. And then at the same time, the PC party, which is in government, is promising to reduce the provincial sales tax if they're reelected with all this surplus money. But that would leave less financial room to build more schools and pay more nurses and all of those things. So this is really the big picture debate that is coming to a head in this election this fall.
So let's talk about politics. You have all these newcomers who have arrived here, and what is it going to mean? How is the population boom going to manifest itself?
Well, there's a number of ways to slice these population growth numbers, and it's a bit of a guessing game right now. But one estimate I have is that there are 13 provincial ridings in the 4 largest cities in the province. That's where most of this growth has been. You could sort of do some rough math and figure there's about 1,600 new voters per riding on average. Some would have more, some would have less. Some of those ridings have been won by a few hundred votes in several recent elections. And this is really going to be a close election. And all the political parties agree that these ridings, some of those ridings, may determine who forms the government. So these new voters may be the decisive factor.
And those voters aren't just numbers, they're people. Who are those people?
Well, I did a story recently on some of them. Akash Rabari is typical of one kind of newcomer, the international arrival. He's from India. He went to university in Toronto, moved here in September 2019 because the province was offering a simpler path to permanent residency through a federal-provincial agreement with Ottawa. He lives in Dieppe. It's adjacent to Moncton, and we went to his house, met him and his wife Krishna, their new baby, born in April. And in their living room, the wall was still covered with Canadian flags to mark Akash becoming a Canadian citizen just 2 days before we visited.
I was glad that I was able to secure my citizenship just before the election. I'm really excited to vote for the first time. I have gone through the list of the candidates for my community, like who is the candidates and stuff like that. And I'm really excited to vote one of them who is willing to change and willing to help our community.
So what about the other stream, those who have moved? We know a lot of those people, those who have moved within Canada, particularly around the time of the pandemic, but perhaps other windows as well.
Yeah, that's right. I've heard the term Zoomtown to describe, an influx of remote workers into a city. And Tom Sosnowski is a good example of that. He and his wife moved to Moncton with their kids in 2021. They were already working remotely in Toronto, so the move was very simple in terms of their jobs, and it meant a much more affordable house price and a house down the street from the school where their kids just have a short walk to school.
It's really a wonderful place to live for remote work, so it really made a lot of sense for the move.
So in a way, you're kind of typical of the within Canada migration that we've seen here?
Yeah, I suppose so. I think honestly we were living in a very small apartment in the middle of Toronto, and we were looking for maximum change, I guess you would say. And so this was a very logical move for that.
Maximum change. Is there any way to predict, again, they're all individuals, but is there any way to predict which way, in general, those voters will go?
Well, the political parties would love to figure that out, really. They'd love to get a handle on that. Interesting, some of these voters are approaching this question with a lot of humility. Here's Tom Sosnowski again.
You know, you show up somewhere and a part of you thinks, well, I haven't lived here for so long. You know, it's important to vote yes, but do I know enough to really make much of an informed choice? Or should I be the one who comes in, I move in last year, and all of a sudden I'm helping to decide the course of the province's electoral body? It seems a bit quick, a bit sudden.
I mean, you could imagine a lot of people would say that that's a healthy attitude, but he is going to vote.
Oh, he is definitely voting. He is very engaged. He's very aware. His kids are in school, as I said. Education is his top issue. I mean, he is one of the people concerned about what you were dealing with in the last half hour. Mm-hmm. He has seen teachers run out of basic classroom materials like pencils and paper midway through the year. So he feels there's an underfunding issue in education. He would be happy to see corporate taxes go up to provide some of that funding. He puts himself on the left or the progressive side of the spectrum politically. He isn't sure yet if he'll vote Liberal or Green or NDP, but he's definitely going to be voting.
Is he typical of the segment of newcomers who have moved to New Brunswick from within Canada?
Well, you might think the cliche of a downtown Toronto person moving here is going to be on the left side of the spectrum, but it's not necessarily representative at all. One of the highest profile new arrivals in the province is a Christian conservative activist, Fétine Grzeski. She has a popular TV show. She's been active in various political lobbying efforts in Ottawa. She moved here in 2020, and she became a very vocal defender of Premier Blaine Higgs last year when he made changes to the provincial policy on sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. And this policy change prevents kids under 16 from adopting new names and pronouns unless their parents are informed and consent. And it was a huge political story. And this is from an interview from last year with me, where she explained why she was signing people up, collecting names of people who supported the Premier, and she was quoting one of her mentors, the late televangelist David Maines.
And he was talking about different pieces of legislation that were won or lost by like one vote, for example. And he had made that statement once about, basically you can't complain if you're not showing up, right? And not that we want to complain, but we're not looking for the right to complain. But, you can't complain if you're not engaged, and that the nation really goes to those who get involved.
As she says, each vote can have an impact.
That's right. She knows that the numbers matter, definitely.
Especially, as you said, in a very tight election.
That's right. Every vote is going to count. And now Grzeski did not respond to an interview request I sent her for this story, but she's practicing what she preaches. She has been nominated as a PC candidate in this fall's election. And what's interesting is that one of the most vocal advocates on the other side of that issue is also a new arrival. Kristen Kavukian was a political science professor at University of Toronto. She moved here in 2021. She promptly was acclaimed to the Moncton Area English School Board, the District Education Council. This is a board that has fought the province's changes to its policy in court, arguing that the changes violate the constitutional rights of 2S LGBTQ plus students. And she believes those students are being scapegoated for political gain.
Identity politics has no place in this province. This is a tight-knit community. People who've lived here all their lives might not realize how wonderful that is. It has its drawbacks, but for those of us who grew up in really big cities elsewhere, the tight-knitness is wonderful about New Brunswick. And the idea that we would pit neighbor against neighbor over electoral politics is something that frankly rubs me the wrong way, and I would rather not see that happen during this election.
Can we just talk a bit more about the policy change? This got a lot of attention across the country. How is this playing out among the newest New Brunswickers?
Well, like everyone else, they're very engaged with it. Tom Sosnowski told me he has no time for it at all. He says the provincial government should let kids be who they are, in his words, and focus on some of the issues that concern him. He thinks it's a big waste of time. We do know some recent immigrants have socially conservative views, including on 2S LGBTQ plus issues. I spoke to Pam Naspil, who is originally from the Philippines. She works in marketing and administration in Moncton. She became a citizen in January, and she's so busy I had to catch up with her while she was driving to a work meeting.
I have friends who are members of the community. I will be a little bit conflicted, though, if they start putting it in the school system, because I'm a Christian, and that's where the disjoint will be for me. I still believe that as a parent of a minor child, I still would like to know what's happening.
Is your sense this will be one of those big issues in the campaign?
I think so. There's been some postcards mailed by a Christian conservative groups talking about it. And the PC party is not talking about it, but others are talking about it, trying to revive it. And so I think it's going to be there, even though the polls would indicate cost of living, healthcare, all that are the top issues.
We've walked through some of those other issues. What else is top of mind for new arrivals? And again, as we said earlier, new arrival can be, you've been here for a few months, you've been here for a few years. But what are the other issues that they're talking about?
Yeah, they're not a monolith. I mean, they're all over the map like everyone else. And a lot of their issues are frankly very ordinary and typical of longtime New Brunswickers and not that different, like taxes, property taxes. Akash Rabari was unhappy that the property tax bill on the house he bought last year doubled after the sale. He says the PC party's promise to cut the provincial sales tax has got his attention. But like many New Brunswickers, he's not happy with the healthcare system.
It was hard when my wife was pregnant last couple of months ago, and we didn't have a doctor. So at one time, we had to wait overnight at the hospital just because she was coughing too much. So that's something that we don't like about this situation, like about this government, that there's not enough medical professionals available.
I mean, healthcare is healthcare. It doesn't matter, when you arrived or where you came from. If you're trying to find a doctor, you're trying to find a doctor. And the same would apply to cost of living issues. The same would apply to housing, to education.
That's right. And you may have an expectation as a new arrival things were going to be better, that these things were going to be better than what you found.
But in many ways, I mean, these voters just sound like longtime New Brunswickers. I
think so, except there's one important difference that Kristen Kavukian mentioned that hadn't occurred to me when I was working on this story, is that there are a lot of entrenched voting patterns in New Brunswick. You may vote a certain way based on whether you're Anglophone or Francophone, what town you grew up in, who your family is, who you know. But with these new voters, there is no pattern.
For example, the linguistic divide is not going to be salient for newcomers to New Brunswick. A lot of us actually come from very multicultural places. So the fact that one language would sort of shape our politics when people around us have always spoken lots of languages, I think that's something that a lot of us won't be used to. But I think that in a lot of ways, political parties have assumed that they have the support of a certain segment of the population. And I don't think that they can assume that based on the linguistic preference of newcomers, for example.
Read a great piece on the CBC News website talking about how this is kind of an X factor
That's right.
in this election. Given that, are those political parties looking at ways to reach these new voters?
I think they want to, but it's not straightforward how to do that. The Liberal leader, Susan Holt, told me they can't find these new voters yet. They have an app that they use to track supporters, but it uses the provincial voters list. And a lot of these new arrivals will only get on the voting list around now or in the next couple of weeks once the campaign starts. The Green Party, which is the third party here in New Brunswick. They had 3 seats in the legislature as of dissolution. Told me their priority is to let new voters know that they're a factor here, because a lot of people will have come from places where the Green Party is not a factor in elections. As for the PCs, I was at a candidate nomination meeting they held last week in Bathurst in northern New Brunswick. The candidate, the current mayor, has worked with immigrants in the community, helping them with settlement, and several of them attended her nomination. But province-wide, there doesn't seem to be a plan for specific outreach, according to Premier Blaine Higgs, the PC leader. He says he recognizes, though, that many immigrants have socially conservative views. The party hasn't recruited anyone from these communities to run for them, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah. And he says there's no specific effort to seek their support.
Not at this time. I think we want to encourage certainly all the newcomers that are eligible to vote. I think that many of the new immigrant families, would support our policies, and whether it be fiscally or whether it be in terms of our commitments to families and parents. So I think there's certainly a connection in that way, but we want the newcomers to be engaged in the process.
Where do you think this goes from here?
Well, we'll see on election night, and we'll be looking at the numbers in the database to see how many people voted in some of these ridings that have experienced all this growth. And then after that, Richard Saillant, the economist, says that the rate of population growth will eventually level off because we see the federal government now starting to scale back on some immigration numbers. But he says the ripple effects of all of this will continue for a while before we kind of reach a new equilibrium. Whether schools will ever catch up, we'll see. But eventually we will see what this new New Brunswick kind of settles into.
But it's such a pretty part of the country. You can imagine, there's all sorts of reasons why people move to various places. That maximum change from a small apartment in downtown Toronto could be one of them, pace of life, but also just being here and seeing the place is kind of its own. You could put it on a billboard, that's going to attract people here.
Sure, yes, you could. And you wonder whether the government may want things to slow down a bit because it's so hard to keep up. But yeah, maximum change is probably the right term for the whole thing.
This is fascinating. Jacques, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jacques Poitras is the CBC's provincial affairs reporter in New Brunswick, and he joined me here in our studio in Fredericton.